Can you see and hear me?
I can, Dr. Traynor. Thank you very much.
Today's first witness is Nicola Dickey. Please, can the witness be sworn?
Good morning, Miss Dickey. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Could you repeat after me, please? I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Ms Dickey, thank you for coming back to assist the inquiry again and for providing Modulate with a witness statement dated the 8th of August 2025, which we have at INQ 000 588 065. I think you should have it in front of you. I'll wait a moment.
She's not on the screen. I have to say some sort of pause. Do you want to just say we're having a chat?
Sorry, what are we waiting for?
We're having a technical issue, my lady.
Oh,
So we just pause a moment.
You should just ask her to rise for a minute while we fix it. Pause for a minute while we fix it. If you could just bear with us. Just say please bear with us for a moment.
Lady, if you could just bear with us for a moment. I think we have Miss Dickey now. Miss Dickey, can you see and hear me?
yes, I can.
Great. Miss Dickey, thank you for coming back again to assist the inquiry and for the provision of your witness statement to Modulate, which is at INQ 000 588 065. I think you should have that in front of you. Can you confirm that the contents of that statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief, Miss Dickey?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. Ms Dickey, you're giving your evidence today in your capacity as Director of People Policy in the Convention of Scottish Local Authorities, which I think we can refer to as COSLA. I understand you've held that role since 2021, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And by way of brief reintroduction, COSLA is a councillor-led cross-party membership organisation for all 32 local authorities in Scotland, and its purpose is to act as the representative voice for local government in Scotland. Is that an accurate, if brief, summary?
Yes, it is. Thank you.
Ms Dickey, perhaps we could begin by my asking you, what responsibilities do local authorities in Scotland have in relation to children and young people in particular?
So local authorities in Scotland have a number of responsibilities in relation to children. We provide primary and secondary.
Ms Dickey, I apologise for cutting across you. Would you mind just slowing down slightly just for the benefit of our stenographer?
So we provide primary and secondary education to children and young people in Scotland. We provide housing and homelessness services. We provide non-commercial bus services and school transport, early learning and childcare services, social work and social care services, and the protection of vulnerable children and adults, and more generally, access to sports, leisure, parks and other related physical assets.
Thank you. And I think aligned with that, COSLA itself has a dedicated children and young people's work stream, is that correct?
Yes, we do, in a policy team made up of politicians that support that team.
Thank you. Let's begin by looking at the role of local authorities in planning for school closures in Scotland between January and March 2020, if we may. I understand from your statement that local authorities in Scotland are represented in emergency planning structures, but that COSLA itself is not represented on those structures. Is that correct?
So we've got no statutory representation on those structures, albeit we will be brought into those structures if the matters at play are more than just civil contingency, so policy issues, and in children and young people, that was certainly the case.
I'm grateful. Now, in your statement, you describe a lack of discussion between the Scottish Government and COSLA about planning for school closures prior to March 2020. And I wanted to ask you, to what extent do you understand there to have been any direct engagement between the Scottish Government and local authorities through, for example, local resilience partnerships in that period?
So I think the conversations that were ongoing as part of the resilience structures were much more generalised in terms of the way the resilience structures are put together in Scotland. School closures are not unique to the pandemic. The size and the scale of school closures was what probably merited significant discussion. So I suspect in the period between January to March, resilience structures had tried and tested things that they would do at a local level should one or two schools have to be closed as a result of, for example, an infectious disease like measles or mumps, or indeed inclement weather. So we certainly have good tried and tested methods when we're closing schools in a particular locality or a region. But I suspect the size and scale of this meant that it probably did merit a bit more of a conversation. But the resilience structures are not necessarily the structures in Scotland that would give you that policy insight or the unintended consequences, perhaps, of closing schools.
I see. And in that answer, you indicate that the planning would have been more generalised, and you suggest that planning would have been predicated on the basis of one or two schools having to close, but perhaps not the more widespread closures. Just so that I have understood that correctly, is it the case that there wouldn't then have been well-developed plans in the event that all schools in Scotland would have to close?
I certainly don't recall seeing a plan for a national closure of all schools, but what I do know is that local resilience structures have plans if that has to happen across a region. For example, a whole council area, we would have those plans in terms of what would happen. The other thing is that it's much more usual to do that, particularly in the north of Scotland, around about inclement weather, but that's for a short period of time. There's no sustained, for 2 or 3 days at a time if there's a lot of snow, wind or rain or whatever, but certainly not for an extended period of time.
Thank you. Now, there's some suggestion that local authorities in Scotland may, at least to some degree, have begun planning for the potential impact on schools by, I think, the 17th of February 2020. Does that accord with your understanding of the work being done by your membership in February 2020?
Yes, it does. But what I would say is that some areas were at a different stage in that planning, because some areas already had that infrastructure up and running. So in normal series of events, there are some local authorities in Scotland that already use, for example, remote learning for specialist subjects. So a teacher in one high school would be running a class remotely for children in another high school. So that was happening in some areas because of sheer geography or indeed access to teachers, whereas in some of our other schools that remote learning was not taking place in the normal run of things. So I think it's fair to say that everybody was starting to consider what would happen, but I don't think that planning was uniform at that stage.
Thank you, Ms Dickey. Now, on the 13th of March 2020, just to close off on this point, a joint letter issued from the Scottish Government and COSLA to local authorities seeking assurance, really, that local authorities had appropriate contingency plans in place. And was the onus on local authorities themselves to come up with their own contingency plans, or were there plans held at Scottish Government level, for example, that could be implemented by local authorities?
So the statutory responsibility would be for the individual local authority to plan. What we would have at a national level would be a general understanding of what would have to be maintained if schools would have to close. But I don't think at that point it was at the scale or for the length of time that it subsequently came through. So statutory responsibility on the individual local authorities. From a COSLA perspective, we would be working across our heads of education and chief executives to try and pool the knowledge and pool the issues that were being foreseen. But certainly the scale and the length of time probably meant that the national plans that were there were probably not fit for what we were facing.
Okay. Now, in your statement, and for your reference, Ms Dickey, this is paragraph 4.1, you say that the first meeting of the Scottish Government Resilience Cabinet Subcommittee, or SCORE, I think is the acronym, in relation to COVID-19 took place on the 16th of March and was attended by the COSLA Chief Executive. And I just wanted to clarify that with you, Ms Dickey. I think it's right that SCORE had been meeting throughout February, and I wondered, is that rather the first occasion on which COSLA was invited to attend meetings of that structure formally?
So the 16th of March was the first time that COSLA attended that structure formally. Up until that point, we were not invited into SCORE. What I would say is in that earlier period, there were discussions ongoing at a senior level between the two organisations. So there was some information being fed in from COSLA and our local authorities, but that was much, much less formal.
So just to clarify, is it really around that point in mid-March then that we begin to see COSLA becoming more formally involved in the pandemic? Thank you. Now, in your statement, you also refer to a meeting on the 16th of March. I think it's a separate meeting between Scottish Government officers and COSLA officers at which issues with teacher and pupil attendance were discussed, and I think it was agreed that a daily survey would be carried out in respect of that. Can I just clarify, what was the difficulty with attendance at that point?
So we were starting to see variation in the numbers of teachers who were physically present in our schools, and the same thing was happening with children and young people. I suppose the public more generally were becoming aware of the virus, and indeed we were starting to see guidance being issued around about public behaviour. We were also starting to think about what were the populations that we're going to have to shield. So I think, first of all, we had to get an understanding at a kind of national and regional level about how that was playing out. But more generally, it also meant that it was becoming clear as we were going to move through the pandemic that things were going to have to change in schools. We needed to get an understanding of how many teachers would, for example, potentially be asked to shield, how many children and young people would be there. So it was trying to get a kind of handle so that we could see that at a national level. Obviously, schools and local authorities had that information at a local level, but it wasn't being funnelled up the way prior to that agreement.
Thank you. I'd like to move on then to look at school closures in Scotland and how that decision was implemented by local authorities. Now, on the 18th of March 2020, the First Minister announced that schools would close by the end of that week. When was COSLA first informed of that decision? So
I think we were made aware of it over the evening of the kind of 16th, 17th, that it was something that was potentially going to happen. But that's my recollection of that.
Thank you. And prior to that, what was local government's understanding of the potential need or likelihood of school closures in Scotland?
I think our understanding was becoming clearer, and I suppose that was born out of the fact that schools don't sit in isolation, so we could see what was starting to happen across other parts of civic society in Scotland, and to an extent starting to read the music. So I think there was a general understanding that schooling as it was not going to continue. But with so much of what we were doing in that early period, it was really unclear the extent to which that might have to play out. The other thing, I don't need to tell anyone in the inquiry, is that the clinical advice was still being shaped and was still being delivered to the public more generally. So there was a lot of contingency planning and scenario planning going on in terms of if you were keeping schools open and how were you going to make them COVID safe. If you were going to be closing schools, what did that mean, and how could we safeguard our children and young people in the workforce?
Ms Dickey, in that answer, you refer to reading the music, and I suppose my question is the sense that you're giving the inquiry that really COSLA was discerning that this was a potential course that may need to be taken itself, or was the likelihood that this would be required being formally communicated to you?
So I think it was being formally communicated that it was certainly one of the scenarios that were on the table. I don't want to give the impression that COSLA was being held at arm's length as part of these conversations. It was just that everything was moving so quickly, and there was a lot of unknowns in the system at any given time. So there was no suggestion that we were being, as I say, held at arm's length, but there were a number of unknowns, and they were unknown right up until the point that we started to solidify the plans.
Yes. Now, in your statement, you explain that in terms of how that decision was given effect, at that point in time, it was local authorities in Scotland who had the legal power to take the decisions and actions necessary to close schools. And I wonder, at the point at which they closed, had any guidance or direction or framework been provided to local authorities by the Scottish Government as to how those school closures should be implemented?
So I think as we were going through that week and we were clear that schools were going to be closing as we knew them, at the end of that week, there were some high-level conversations were going on, but I don't think we were in a position that guidance was issued by closure of the schools more generally on the Friday. What I would say about that is that I suspect that had government come out with a lot of guidance, had it not been developed alongside people who were working in our schools or our heads of education or indeed our local authority chief execs, that the guidance probably would not have been fit for purpose. So there was something about bringing the experts together and taking the time to write the guidance, but we were not in a position where we had a handbook that we could hand out across all 32 councils to say this is what it should look like by that point.
Okay. And in your statement, you say then that school closures presented significant operational and logistical challenges to local authorities. Could you give us a sense of the nature and scale of those challenges?
So I think there was the workforce element in terms of what removing even the teaching workforces from our education establishments and setting them up to be able to provide remote learning in itself was a challenge. Our workforce has different skills. They are used to delivering education in a particular way. So there was definitely a logistical challenge for individual head teachers and directors of education to think about the workforce. There was the children and families in terms of how could we support them and how could we provide guidance as we were still coming to an understanding of what remote and indeed digital learning was going to become. So I suspect if you speak to teachers at that time, there was some schools that were literally physically printing packs of learning for children to take home with them. There were other schools who were in a situation where they were able to find digital devices that individual children could take away with them. And then I suppose the other area was the things that our schools provide over and above education. So access to free school meals, making sure that our children are feeling supported in the community more generally. And it's not a long time between the kind of Monday or Tuesday of that week and schools being closed on the Friday. So I think there was a lot of pretty fast operational decisions had to be taken to see what was physically going to be possible, and then what was the remote learning offer going to be.
Thank you, Ms Dickey. I'd like to move on then to look at how councils in Scotland met their responsibilities in terms of the protection of vulnerable children throughout the pandemic. And I'd like to begin this part of your evidence by asking you about how that policy was being communicated to local authorities. Now, I'm just going to read from this. It is the COSLA elected members briefing of the 24th of March 2020. For you, Ms Dickey, it's at tab 14, and for the transcript, it's at INQ 000 300 855 at page 7. And it says that local authorities worked through the weekend to arrange childcare provisions for key workers. This will look different in every area, and further information can be found on the Scottish Government website. Ms Dickey, the provision being made is described there and elsewhere, I think, as childcare rather than education. And I wondered, is that a more accurate description of what was being provided to children on the ground in hubs at that time?
I think it depends what age and stage the children were at. If that's honest, and I suppose that that's one of the challenges that we had throughout the period of the pandemic, that children are not one homogenous group. And as we discussed at the start of this evidence session, the statutory responsibilities that local authorities have for children and young people is vast. It's from birth right up to, in Scotland, almost 25 if you're care experienced. So I think they're depending on the age and stage of the child and the provision that was available, there was an element of childcare to allow key workers to be able to be in their own employment, but there was a real focus on making sure that we could maintain education as far as we possibly could.
And Ms Dickey, you just mentioned key workers. I think it's also right that briefing doesn't refer to vulnerable children. And I just wondered, is that a reflection of an initial prioritisation of key workers at that point in time?
No,
children of key workers, rather.
I don't think it is. I think what's true of local government in Scotland is that we've got a statutory responsibility to look after vulnerable children and young people. So my reading of that, it was taken as read that vulnerable children were included within the hub. So I don't think it's right to read too much into the fact that vulnerable children are not there. And I think we subsequently came on and we agreed definitions for when vulnerable children would be accessing the hubs. So I don't think it's that. What I would say is the definition of key workers was tricky to kind of nail down as well, and that a lot of that was to do with the fact that key workers are not necessarily routine depending on where you are in Scotland. So if we think about key workers in and around about Grangemouth Refinery versus what a key worker might look like in the rural Scottish borders. So there was an element of having to kind of firm up what we meant in and around about key workers as well, that was important on the capacity that would be required in the hubs as well.
Thank you. Now, Ms Dickey, the Children and Young People's Commissioner for Scotland describes significant variation between local authorities in the interpretation of criteria to attend hubs. I understand from your evidence that COSLA would not have had any responsibility for monitoring the consistency of that provision. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Are you aware of any monitoring of how local authorities were applying the definition of vulnerable children to identify who could attend school?
So I think we were providing the statistics and those were coming in, but there's no statutory monitoring going on at that period. But the COVID Education Recovery Group is meeting quite frequently there, where all of the stakeholders would be able to raise those inconsistencies that you've just alluded to. But I'm not aware of the statutory monitoring going on.
Okay. Now, the Commissioner also pointed to particular difficulties with provision for children experiencing domestic abuse, and Scottish Women's Aid also described provision for those children as patchy and reported difficulties with being able to refer children in to school places through local processes. Is that issue familiar to you?
It's certainly one that resonated thinking back at the time, and I know that the inquiry's coming on to do Module 10 and violence against women and girls is one of the areas that COSLA's provided evidence there. I think there were a number of issues in terms of domestic abuse services, and it goes back to what I've said about a definition of a key worker as well. So I know that there were issues with those providing support for domestic abuse services not being considered key workers in the initial stages, and I think that's something that we need to think about as we move forward.
And both the Commissioner and the Care Inspectorate also highlight specific challenges faced by children with disabilities arising from school closures in relation to the suspension of key supports such as respite care provision, coupled with the restriction on face-to-face teaching. To what extent had the particular needs of those children been recognised and understood by local authorities in planning for and making provision for school places?
So I'm sure the inquiry is aware that in Scotland we have a principle around about getting it right for every child. So the needs of children living with a disability or other support needs were individualised out with the pandemic. That makes it incredibly difficult when we're doing things at a kind of national level, or we're doing things kind of once. So I think that there were challenges with access for individual children that I think you can see through the documents that we provided came up certainly through COSLA's political structures and in the wider conversations at the COVID Education Recovery Group. So I think local authorities were aware of them. I think the complexity of the system in and around about unintended consequences of where we were in closing our schools, but also unintended consequences in terms of the access that other supporting adults in children's lives had to support those children, was certainly something that has impacted the support that our children with additional support needs receive.
And you mentioned a moment ago difficulties around the definition of an essential worker. I think it's right that in May 2020 a revised definition of vulnerable children was agreed, and that was expanded to include children affected by disability and those experiencing domestic abuse. And in your statement you explain that was intended to assist in ensuring that all children in vulnerable circumstances received appropriate help. Ms Dickey, is that an acknowledgement that there were children in vulnerable circumstances who had not been receiving help in that initial period because they were excluded from the initial definition?
I think it was an attempt to bring a lot more consistency to what had become an established practice on the ground at that point. So if I go back to the getting it right for every child, the adults that were supporting individual children between the times of the first definition and the definition changing were in effect advocating for every child to get access to the hub. The amended definition meant that we had a clear stated intention and a consistent application of that moving forward.
Now, you've said in your statement that the lack of visibility of children and young people in the initial period of school closure was a challenge. Is the point there that the closure of schools will have reduced opportunities for risk identification in respect of vulnerable children?
Yes, so that's definitely an element of it. Our teachers and our support staff in our schools have consistent access to children and young people, and they understand and know them as individual characters. The other thing that was true was that the other statutory services were also going through changes to the way in which they were delivering their services, and I think you've heard from other witnesses, there were unintended consequences of the way in which drugs and alcohol services changed their services and access to support for adults, and how that then impacted on children. So I think the closure of schools was one part of that. The changes that we made in other parts of the public sector also meant that we had reduced visibility of our children and young people, not just through our schools and education settings.
And Ms Dickey, was that reflected in the pattern of child protection referrals to local authorities in terms of the numbers and sources of those referrals?
I think it was, and I suppose an example going back to violence against women and girls. We had conversations with policing who people potentially, if they had been a victim of domestic abuse, didn't want to phone the police and invite the police to come to the house if the person who was in their house was not part of their family bubble, etc. So I think there were a number of reasons why the referrals came down, but not all of those reasons were because we closed schools. There were other things that were at play there in children and young people's lives.
Okay. And what steps did local authorities take then to try to improve the visibility of those children who might be at risk?
So I think in the COSLA witness statement, and indeed the work of the care inspectorate and others, I think there was a lot of innovative practice going on. I think social care staff and social workers worked really hard to make sure that they were seeing and hearing from children and young people. But again, that really depended on the young person, what was the best way to access that young person and what would work for them. More generally, it also was cognizant of the wider restrictions that we were all kind of living under at that point. So face to face was not necessarily the right thing for everyone. I think our children and young people who are in the early teens or are kind of going up into their late teens, access to online facilities actually meant that some social workers had more access to children and young people who were that age because they were used to all of their interaction being digital and online, etc.
Okay, thank you. Ms Dickey, I'll move on then to look at changes to the provision of children's social care in Scotland during the pandemic. Now, the Coronavirus Act 2020 contained provisions which permitted local authorities to dispense, I think, with particular social care assessment duties, including those relating to children. Can you provide some practical examples of how those easements impacted children's services in Scotland?
So I think the number of easements that were used were minimal in terms of what access children and young people had to social care services. Unfortunately, I'm not a practicing social worker, so the practice on the ground is not something that I can provide much commentary on. But again, we were monitoring the use of those easements, and that was being fed up through Scottish Government. And I remember at the time we were having conversations about whether the easements that were being applied were consistent across different areas, and were the outcomes that were important to children and young people still being delivered upon as best as we possibly could.
And what was the answer to that question? Were they being consistently applied?
I think there was a level of reassurance that social workers and chief officers across the areas understood their statutory requirements well, and they understood where the risk was. And
Ms Dickey, we've heard that in England and Northern Ireland the law was amended so that relevant bodies were required to demonstrate their best endeavours or reasonable endeavours. To be clear, there was no equivalent requirement in the law in Scotland, is that right?
That's right, yes.
Okay, and in your statement you explain, and for your reference this is paragraph 7.5, you explain that the provisions allowed local authorities the flexibility to focus on prioritising those with the most urgent need while ensuring effective safeguards. What were those specific effective safeguards that you refer to that local authorities were expected to maintain when using those easements?
So I think they were in and around making sure that whilst children were not potentially being put onto a child protection order, there was still ongoing support for that family, and we've had a bit of a conversation already in terms of what that might have looked like. It may also not necessarily have been formal or statutory intervention by an individual local authority. It might have been matching a family up with a local third sector organisation that were willing to work with those families that were not meeting the threshold for potentially statutory intervention.
And where do we find those safeguards? Was guidance provided to local authorities about what the expectations were?
So I think the easements themselves that were available meant that everything that wasn't covered by an easement was potentially an area that local authorities could work across their partners to think about how they supported individual families. So I think it would have been impossible for us to provide guidance at a national level that covered every eventuality, given the collaboration and partnerships across the different areas. But certainly my memory of that time was that chief social work officers were supporting their field social work officers to make sure that they were aware of the types of support that was available across civic society and communities more generally.
Okay. Now, I understand from your statement that from around May 2020, the Scottish Government began collating data from local authorities about the use of those powers via survey. Can you give us a sense, I think you've touched on it a moment ago, but can you give us a sense of how prevalent the use of those easements was?
So I don't recall the use of the easements being extensive. I think that there was recognition in the professional groupings that were supporting children and families that families were under a great degree of stress. So I don't recall the easements being used at any great scale across Scotland. I think there probably were pockets that they were used, but they were certainly, when they were used for a very limited amount of time, given the risks associated with.
Thank you. And Ms Dickey, over the course of your evidence, we've discussed the use of remote visits, the suspension of these statutory duties, and the reduced number of child protection referrals. What systems were put in place by local authorities to compensate for the attendant risks to children?
So I think we did a number of things. I think we did regional campaigns in Scotland, bringing child protection concerns to the general public, more generally, kind of saying, if you see something and you think it's not right, here are the ways that you can reach out to statutory services at a national level. As I say, we were working extensively with our third sector partners, and we've had a bit of a discussion in terms of Women's Aid, but we were also working with other partners at a local level who were also doing lots of things online and making sure that we were clear that if another third sector organisation or agency had concerns with a child or young person, that they should absolutely be raising those. That was true of our colleagues in the health service as well. So we were making sure that if, I suppose I would categorise it as that any interaction with a child or young person where someone felt it was something that required additional support, people were clear how that should be referred into the statutory services. The statutory services were not closed, and they were there to take those referrals.
Thank you. And Ms Dickey, based upon the information it has received from its membership, has COSLA identified any enduring impacts of the pandemic on children's services in Scotland?
So I think that there are some positives. I think things like children's case conferences, we have better representation from partners because it became the norm for those to be done with access remotely for professionals. So it was sometimes difficult to get all of the professionals into a room in person. We did that during the pandemic, and we've kept some of that going. I think that there's a long tail in our statutory services. So things like the children's hearing system, getting it back on to an even keel has taken a level of time. Similarly, where we've had children's services issues that need to go through the court systems, the backlogs that are within the court system are having an impact. So, and I suppose that the last thing that's clear is that the level of need in children's services and indeed the complexity of children who are coming forward for support, from my perspective at a national level, seems to be higher than it was pre-pandemic. But again, I'm not a practicing social worker, so that's how it feels for me sitting in a national policy position.
Thank you, Ms Dickey. And finally then, Ms Dickey, I'd just like to ask you about the learning and recommendations that you identify in your statement. In your statement, you suggest there was strong and consistent engagement by the Scottish Government with local government throughout the response to COVID-19. But if I may, Ms Dickey, one gets the sense from your statement and the documentation that at times that communication perhaps wasn't all that it could have been. And I wondered whether you see any room for improvement in terms of the communication between main government and local government in the event of a future pandemic.
I think we can always do more as the two tiers of government that operate in Scotland to get clarity of message. I think I've said everything was moving incredibly fast and was incredibly complex. My experience was, as I've already said, that we weren't being kept at arm's length, but there was a lot of information was being communicated. I think in terms of other lessons learned, there was some innovation in terms of how education was provided in Scotland, and I think as well as thinking about the things that we can do better if we're ever faced with this situation again, there's something about making sure we learn the lessons of things that worked well for our children and young people, and thinking about how we kind of hard code them in. Definitions of key workers. My lady's heard me say in a previous module, that's stuff that we can think about in advance, and we perhaps wouldn't be in a situation where we had to have women's aid services advocating for them to be included as key workers. So I think there are a number of things that we could have in effect ready to go in advance. Another would be, what is the bare minimum that we expect from remote learning, and how does that fit with our business as usual processes? So those are the thoughts that I've got.
Thank you very much, Ms Dickey. My lady, those are all of my questions. Have you any questions?
No, thank you very much. I think Mr. Wagner has a question.
Good morning, Ms Dickey. I act for Clinically Vulnerable Families, which protects the interests of clinically vulnerable people and their children and the immunocompromised. I just want to ask you about one topic, which is outdoor play. And this relates to something you say at paragraph 16.2 of your statement. You refer to a Kostler paper, which is from June 2021, which looked at a range of topics, including outdoor learning. And one of the things, I'll just read briefly from it, so we don't have to go to it. But paragraph 10 of that paper, it says, advice throughout the pandemic from COVID-19 Advisory Subgroup on Education and Children's Issues has encouraged children and young people to spend as much time outside as possible to limit transmission of COVID-19. The ICEA report highlights that outdoor learning should be a greater focus for how education is delivered. And it says local authorities have developed several modules to support greater access to the outdoors every day for children, in addition to the offer of 1,140 hours ELC expansion. First of all, can I ask you why you and Kostler consider that outdoor learning is important when planning for future pandemics?
So I think there was something about understanding what the outdoor learning estate was in Scotland. Certainly in our early learning and childcare settings in Scotland, we have some settings that are wholly outdoor learning based, and it also, I suppose, that the learning from the pandemic was that those services that had access to an awful lot of outdoor learning facility were the ones that were able to recover quicker. They were also the areas where that we could comply with social distancing, and I suppose the collective wisdom is that when children are learning through outdoor play, they're getting more out of it in the longer run.
Getting more out of it from an educational perspective?
Well, yes.
Yeah, and also safer from airborne viruses, is that fair?
Yes, and obviously certainly during the pandemic, the rules for when you were indoors or when you were outdoors, the distancing was different, so it physically meant there was more capacity in those spaces.
Could you give a bit more detail about what could be done to achieve that expansion of outdoor learning in the short and medium term?
So I think it goes back to one of the conversations we've had earlier in my evidence. More and more in Scotland, we're thinking about the estate that's available to us, and more and more of our settings are working towards having both indoor learning and outdoor learning spaces. So, it's things like trying to make sure that all schools have got access to mud kitchens and, areas where children can be playing. What I would say is that needs to be done at a local level. How you provide outdoor learning in the Highlands of Scotland will be entirely different to how you would provide it in the centre of Glasgow. So I would have some nervousness in us issuing some sort of national guidance that says it should look like this, because the provision needs to work for local conditions and importantly local children and young people.
Yeah, so the guidance would be more about general principles than specific measures.
Yeah.
And just finally, have Kostler considered any other measures as part of this planning to avoid airborne spread? For example, mechanical ventilation in school buildings.
So it wouldn't be for COSLA to consider those, it would be for individual local authorities that run the school estate in Scotland. I think there is a huge school renewal programme ongoing across Scotland in partnership with Scottish Government, and local authorities are keeping pace with where the thinking has got to on that, but it wouldn't be for COSLA to determine what should be happening at a local level.
Would it be something that COSLA encourages?
It's certainly something that we could think about and consider in the round as we're considering the findings that come from the inquiry, I suspect.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Wagner. That completes the questions we had for you, Mr. Key. I think we might be calling you once more, aren't we? So I can't say goodbye and thank you, but thank you for your help to the inquiry to date.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Ms. Coon.
My lady, good morning. The next witness is Miss Sarah Hammond of Kent County Council. She is attending in person and she is about to enter the hearing room. Thank you. May I please call Miss Sarah Hammond?
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Miss Hammond. You have given a witness statement to this inquiry. I think you have it in front of you. The reference that we have for it is INQ 000588016. I think you signed that witness statement on the 1st of August 2025. Are you satisfied that its contents are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I am.
Thank you. Ms Hammond, you are the Director of Children's Services at Kent County Council, which is a role that you have held since June 2022. And prior to that, I think you were the Director of Integrated Children's Services at the Council. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. You have in your witness statement given us an overview of Kent as a region and of the child population in Kent. And one of the aspects that you emphasise is that whilst there are areas of affluence in Kent, there are also areas of deprivation. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. And in describing Kent's geography, another aspect that you have emphasised is that because of its coastline, Kent is one of the main entry points to the UK from mainland Europe, leading to a particular set of challenges for Kent Children's Services in terms of Kent's statutory responsibility to safeguard children arriving in its area. We'll come back to that topic in due course, but that's correct.
That is correct, yes.
Thank you. I'd like to begin then, please, with the topic of the local authority's perspective on the manner and consequences of school closures. First of all, with the levels of planning and consultation around those closures. And I'd like us to look, please, to help us in that at INQ 000650658. This is a letter that you exhibited to your witness statement that was sent, I think, by your predecessor at the department to all schools in Kent on the 17th of March. And of course, we know that that's the day before it was announced that all schools would close. Can we look, please, at the first sentence in the second paragraph? We see that all schools were told that the policy on school and early childhood settings and their closure or not is being led nationally by the DFE and Public Health England. So those were not decisions that your local authority was making, were they?
No, they were not.
Thank you. And if we can look at the level of detail that you were able to share with schools at that time, over on page 6, please, under the heading school closures, we see you were telling all schools that the current advice from government is that, notwithstanding taking additional precautions, schools should strive for maintaining business as usual. And towards the end of the second paragraph here, you were saying that the policy was that wherever possible, schools should remain open, even if they have to revert to only acting as a provider of care. And 2 paragraphs further down, please. You were warning, however, as we move further into the UK government's delay phase, there is a strong possibility that Public Health England may instruct an individual school, schools in a defined area, or even schools nationally, to close for a period. And you were suggesting that schools update their business continuity arrangements. And finally, in this letter, if we can look over at page 7, please. We see that you were suggesting at the top of the page, all schools should therefore create a contingency plan to move to providing remote learning activities to their pupils. That should probably read, should they experience a closure or have pupils who cannot attend school. And the paragraph at the bottom of the page shares some information about safeguarding in the event that a pupil or cohort of pupils are required to remain out of school for a prolonged period. This will present challenges in terms of the school's safeguarding responsibilities, and you advise that schools, in terms of family liaison, should continue to maintain assurance that all pupils are safe, and so on. So is it fair to say then that at this stage, on Tuesday the 17th of March, what you were saying to schools were, you should expect to stay open, but there may be closures, you should update contingency plans for remote learning and think about liaising with families. Is that a fair summary?
That is a fair summary, yes.
Thank you. And I think we understand from your statement that this was the first letter of this sort that had been sent to schools. Would that also be right?
That is correct, yes.
Had there been any consultation with you as a local authority about these issues? So likely school closures, schools' preparedness to deliver remote learning, schools' preparedness to shore up safeguarding?
No, there'd been no consultation with us prior to the events actually happening. The emergency planning tools and business continuity plans that Kent schools had at the time were very much focused on the potential for individual schools or groups of schools to need to close, but never about every school needing to close to the majority of pupils, and the implications and the requirements that would need to be put in place as a result of every school closing to the majority of pupils.
Thank you. And in the run-up to your sending this letter on the 17th of March, is it right that you hadn't had any further guidance or detail from the Department for Education about those issues, remote learning or safeguarding, than we see you were able to provide here in this letter?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. And we know that the next day, Wednesday the 18th of March, the then Prime Minister announced national school closures to take effect from the following Monday. Mm-hmm. And if we can look, please, at a letter that the local authority then sent to schools on INQ 000650660. So this is the letter on the 19th of March. Can we look at the second paragraph, please? However, we must apologise, as we were promised a government announcement of the list of who would fall into the category of key worker by 1 o'clock today. This has still not come through. Rather than keeping you waiting, we have decided to send out the letter, and we'll send the key worker list to follow as soon as the information has been provided. Can we take anything from this, Ms Hammond, about the level of communication that the local authority was receiving from the Department for Education at this time?
I think we can. It was late, it was sporadic, we were promised various items of guidance, lists, categories, and they weren't forthcoming.
Thank you. Can we look slightly lower down in the letter, please, at the second page, to the paragraph at the top? Thank you. The expectation also includes being open for vulnerable children, so this is, of course, the expectation that schools would remain open to some children. The definition here is children who are CIC, I think that's children in care.
That's correct, yes.
CHIN, children in need.
That's correct, yes.
Or have a CP plan, is that a child protection?
Child protection plan, yes.
And we know that EHCP are education, health and care plans.
Yes.
The message here for schools was you will need to liaise with the social workers working with those families to identify those most in need and ensure support to enable those children to attend school. Not all parents of children with EHCPs will want to take up the offer of a school place, but they should be offered the opportunity. Having looked at this letter and the letter beforehand, do you consider, Ms Hammond, that the local authority was here able to adequately support individual schools to prepare for what they were going to need to do from the 23rd of March?
We were not. We have over 600 schools in Kent, and we found ourselves in a very challenging position to be able to support all of our schools to work with and support vulnerable children. It was very difficult.
One of the things you say in your statement is that prior consultation by the central government with local government would have greatly assisted in predicting the subsequent impact of school closures, because the central government had not understood that actually the parents of vulnerable children, and just pausing there, I think you mean by that the categories we just saw listed in your letter.
I do, yes.
Would not want to send their children to school and actually might be angered by the policy. Is what you mean by that, Ms Hammond, that in your experience parents were angered by the policy and that this is something that you in local government could have predicted had you been consulted?
Yes. So from our perspective, there was an assumption that parents who could not send their children to school, who would be prevented from sending their children to school, would be the ones who would be frustrated and angered. And that is based on, I think, experience of what happens when a school closes for bad weather or for other reasons. What we found was that those parents who were either able to themselves work from home or were furloughed, whilst they stepped up and at times struggled with the challenge of providing home education for their children, by and large were happy to keep their children at home, keep them safe. Our experience was that the parents of the vulnerable children were very unhappy. They were at times angry. They didn't understand why it was safe for their children to go into school, be exposed in their mind to what the virus might cause for them, when it wasn't safe, or in their perception was that what was being said was it wasn't safe for everybody else's children, and that it wasn't seen as a positive impact for them, something helpful and positive. It was seen as negative, potentially dangerous, and stigmatising.
Thank you. And Ms Hammond, that list that we looked at in your letter, children in care, children in need, or who have a child protection plan, and those with EHCPs, would it be right that those are families whom you as a local authority would know, in a sense? You would have some relationship with them. And so is it your point that you might have been able to give that advice about their likely response to central government had you been asked for your views?
So these were all children that we knew as a local authority, and we would have been able to give that advice and to heed caution, particularly around how that message was communicated to families, that it was a supportive, helpful thing for them, and that their children could be kept safe. And I think that would have gone a long way to encouraging and enabling parents and families of our more vulnerable and disadvantaged children to attend school. Yeah.
Thank you. And in terms of the local authority's role in encouraging some of those children to attend school, or perhaps encouraging the families to feel confident to send those children to school, we saw from the letter of the 19th of March that schools were encouraged to liaise with social workers to identify those children. Can we please look at paragraphs 71 and 72 of your statement to see how you frame the local authority's role in this exercise? We see that you say Kent County Council applied guidance issued by the DFE in relation to descriptors for identifying vulnerable children, as well as including all KCC looked after children and previously looked after children within those we consider to be vulnerable for the purpose of being able to attend schools in Kent. So pausing there, does that mean that in Kent you slightly extended the category, perhaps by using that otherwise vulnerable discretion?
We did, yes. That is what happened, yeah.
Why did you need to do that? Why did you feel you needed to do that?
We felt that the guidance that we received was not adequate to include all the children that we believed would really benefit from being in school. So we extended that to work with our schools to enable them to take in more children than they would necessarily have wanted to or been able to just under the original DFE descriptors.
Thank you, Ms Hammond. You go on to say that your children's services team also relied on the professional judgments of staff at schools in Kent, and at paragraph 72 that schools shared attendance information with the council about a number of vulnerable children attending school, about the number of vulnerable children attending school in person. You say that where a child had been RAG rated, so that's red, amber, green rated, based on child protection risks, your services would review whether or not they were included within the list of vulnerable children attending school in person. And if not, our teams would seek to identify the reason for that in-person attendance. Well, let me ask. I think it's right, isn't it, that local authorities have long had an obligation around school attendance, in monitoring attendance and enforcing attendance if necessary. But this is a different exercise that was introduced in March 2020, isn't it? Was this a new function for the local authority?
It was, because you're absolutely right that we have general duties to ensure children are attending school. All children are attending school. What this was doing was to say we've got a group of children who don't fall into the categories of being formally children in need, i.e. part of a statutory social work service or children on child protection plan or looked after. But we know that there's a cohort of children who are vulnerable, who sit just below that statutory line. So this was a function of trying to ensure that those children who we consider would really benefit from being in school, but were just below that statutory line, could attend school if their parents wanted them to do so.
So, Ms Hammond, within the local authority, you would have already had your sort of normal times attendance team.
Yes.
And you would have your various child protection teams.
Yep.
So whose job was it to do this role? Did you have to put together new teams?
So we have in Kent, we had then and we still do have in Kent, a large and quite substantial early help workforce. So these are members of staff who are working at below the statutory level of statutory intervention, and much of that responsibility went to them to work closely with schools, which they already had a relationship with schools, and particularly with sort of pastoral support staff within our schools to identify and then work with and at times try and persuade those families that whilst they weren't part of the statutory social work cohort of children, that they could attend. And we had some mixed success with that, both in terms of with schools and with parents. We were able to encourage both schools and some parents of those children who fell just below that statutory line to attend school. But it was a sort of dual activity between the early help staff and staff who have relationships with schools more generally.
We have heard from some school leaders this week at the inquiry in respect of that work of trying to encourage attendance and working directly with families. And one of the things that they have said is that they weren't always supported by social workers in that work. And a witness yesterday suggested that his perception was that that was because children's social care services were already quite stretched. In your local authority, would it be right to understand that you did have that resource to go out and do that additional work of encouraging attendance?
Generally, yes, we did. Yes, yeah. And as I say, we utilised our early help workforce, which I think I would say to the inquiry, we are a very large authority, and we have historically had a large workforce in that below statutory space.
Thank you. One particular aspect of the policy around vulnerable children attending school was that those children with an education, health and care plan should be risk assessed on an individual basis to decide whether or not they should be offered a place in school. Were you satisfied that the schools in your area had enough guidance to know about how to go about those risk assessments?
No, I don't think they did. We were able to assist. Many children with EHCPs are known to other parts of children's services. So for those children, children with profound and complex disabilities, or children who would have been potentially known either as children in need or subject to Child Protection Plan, those children we were able to assist in that risk rating. But we were not in a position to be able to support schools, I think, to be fair, to the extent that they might have wanted, to specifically risk assess those children who were known because they had an EHCP and weren't known in other parts of the children's services system.
One of the things that you say in your statement is that there appeared to be variation in how schools made those decisions. Yes. Was it the role of the local authority to monitor that then?
Well, we made it our ambition to monitor how our schools were responding to that request. I think that it was based on good previous relationships and influence, but we were not in a position to be able to direct schools. Slightly easier for the schools who were maintained, but for academy schools and free schools and other schools, independent schools, we were not able to direct, even when we believed that it was in the child's best interest to attend school. If the school felt on balance that they could not manage that particular child with their particular needs within the context of the other requirements on them to social distance, ensure that there were windows open, for example, that fresh air was always passing through the school. So there were children that we believed within children's services, within the council, should be in school, but for whom schools felt they could not manage them in school. And we had some examples of parents wishing their children to be in school, we supporting them to have their child in school, but the school, and I'm talking specifically about the special school estate now, the school themselves were not willing to take the child into school.
And what you describe as your inability to direct the school to do so in those circumstances, so that we understand, is that, do you mean it by way of a lack of legal power, or just because the reality of the situation meant there was nothing that could be done?
A mixture of both, actually. There were no legal powers for us to instruct the schools in an environment that was extremely challenging for them. and we absolutely recognise that. And ultimately, it was their decision. If they felt that they couldn't safely take a child into their school, then they had the authority to say that they wouldn't allow that child into school.
Thank you. Ms Hammond, you may be aware that the Local Government Association conducted a survey of local authorities
Yes,
across
I am.
England and Wales for this inquiry. And one of the things that found is that only 1 in 5 local authorities reported conducting in-depth liaison with school heads to determine who was vulnerable. And only 1 in 5 reported themselves having an organised central list of vulnerable children for that purpose. Obviously, Ms Hammond, you're not here to speak for all councils,
Yes.
and I'm certainly not asking you to do so. But based on your experience of running this function anew within your local authority, are you able to give us any insight into why it may have been done so differently across the country?
I think I would start with people's relationship with schools. By people, I mean local authorities' relationships with schools, which has changed very, very significantly over a number of years now. So you will have seen different quality of relationships between local authorities and their school sector, and some of that will have been dependent on the balance or the proportion of maintained schools, i.e. those that remain connected to the local authority, and those that are independent, i.e. academisation, so relationships with schools. The relationship then further between the statutory services, the social work and intervention services and schools. I think there would have been some local authorities which were totally overwhelmed by what was going on at the time, and potentially it was at that point less important, or they didn't have the resources within their local authority to be able to do that.
Thank you. We also know from the evidence of the Department for Education that department set up a method of working with local authorities to support them in this work through the Regional Education and Children's Teams, known as REACT. And we will hear more about how that operated from witnesses who will come next week. But you tell us, Ms Hammond, in your witness statement, that your experience was that although the REACT team tried to help with our questions, they were not always able to provide the answers needed. Ms Hammond, this might be a very broad question, but what additional central government support did you feel the local authority needed beyond the guidance that you were getting and the support from REACT to implement the policy of getting vulnerable children into schools that you didn't have?
So I've spoken already about the communication and the messaging around why it was important for some children to be in school. A more encouraging message, I would suggest, but also a more directive message to schools about why it was that those children should be in school. And by that I mean more clarity. Much of the guidance was open to interpretation, and schools interpreted it in different ways. I think as far as REACT was concerned, it felt at the time that it was very much a one-way process. So members of REACT would come to meetings, engage in email communications with my colleagues who were part of that at the time. And we were giving information, giving updates, giving suggestions about how policy might be changed or influenced. But we got very little back. So REACT became a process by which, certainly from my local authority's perspective, we were working hard to provide the most up-to-date information to government, but very little, if anything, coming back out in terms of help and support.
Thank you, Ms Hammond. I have just one more question on the topic of attendance at school, and then we'll take a break. In terms of the impact of this policy, you say that attendance in Kent has still not returned to pre-pandemic levels. You say that it's most significant among children with special educational needs and disabilities. And again, we have heard some views from school leaders on this issue of broader attendance. But as the Director of Children's Services, you will have had sight of those trends across your area, across a number of different types of provision. So you've already spoken about differences in your relationships between maintained schools and academies. Again, it's a broad question. What, in your view, is driving that trend of reduced attendance as compared to prior to the pandemic?
Okay, so there's a number of factors here. Before the pandemic, I think there was a general acceptance and importance put in society about the attendance of children at school. There will always be a small number of children and therefore their families who have not wanted to attend school. And that's always been the case. But that agreement between families and I'm going to describe it as the state about the importance of children being in school has changed remarkably. Before the pandemic, it was absolutely accepted that children being in school, the majority of children being in school, it was the right place for them to be. And indeed, school attendance is what enables, apart from the benefits for the children, of course, it's what enables families to function, to be able to go to work and live their lives knowing that their children are safely being educated at school. What the pandemic did was to turn that completely on its head. So children were sent home, parents were expected to educate their children at home, and many of them did that extremely well and found ways of being able to do that. But in their own minds started to question, well, does my child need to be in school every day? If actually it was okay during the pandemic for them to be at school not to be at school for 4 months. So there's something about a change in the compact, if you like, between the state and parents. There's no doubt that hybrid working now also facilitates parents to be at home more than they were before the pandemic. And so that situation where if your child doesn't want to go to school or there's a problem, or it's much easier to manage it now because you haven't necessarily got to drop your child at school and then go to work. But the other really critical thing is the huge increase in our children's resilience, mental well-being, and ability to go to school despite them not feeling necessarily that they don't want to be in school that day. And so we've seen a really worrying increase in the number of children who have school anxiety, unable to cope in the school setting. And we do see that for those children who would have been just starting or a little way into their school career at the time of lockdown.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Hammond. My lady, I think that may be a convenient moment to go to the break. Oh, my lady, I'm sorry, we cannot hear you.
Sorry. I had the cursor ready but didn't press. I shall return at 25 to 12.
Thank you. My lady, can you see and hear me?
I can hear you. Yes, I can see you now.
Thank you. We'll continue. Ms Hammond, we were about to move then to our second topic, which is the impact of the pandemic on social work practice with children and families. You tell us in your statement that your local authority started using virtual visits by social workers at the beginning of lockdown in March 2020 and carried that through to September 2020 before face-to-face visits were resumed. You give us some detail in your statement about how social work managers risk-assessed children whose cases were open to the services. And I want to ask you about that process and how it worked in a moment. Before I do that, I'd like to ask you about the principle of the use of virtual visits as opposed to in-person visits for child protection work. You may know, Ms Hammond, that we heard yesterday from Miss Alison Morton, who is the Executive Director of the Institute of Health Visitors. And she told us about health visitors' concerns about the limits of remote visits as opposed to in-person visits. And she described, for example, the sorts of cues that a health visitor is looking for when they enter the home that may indicate neglect, abuse, or a parent suffering from mental health challenges.
Yep.
Did you and your social workers have similar concerns about the principle of remote visits in the place of in-person visits in the context of child protection practice?
So yes, we did, and it was on for two reasons. Social work, really good social work, is relationship-based. And it starts from the moment that you first encounter and meet the family and the child. And that is undoubtedly best done in person, meeting somebody in person. So the foundations of our social work practice and our practice framework in Kent is relationship-based. And that was very, very difficult, if not, I would go so far as to say impossible, when you were meeting families for the first time in a virtual space. But even more significantly for that is that the work of a social worker entails being observant, observing parent-child interactions, relationships, whether parents pick up on children's cues for very young children, the conditions in the home, being able to see around the home, particularly the child's bedroom. Actually, on occasions, being able to smell the home and get a sense of what may be going on in the home. Having a look in the fridge. Is there sufficient food? And then, equally important for some of our child protection cases, who is in that home? Who else is there that shouldn't be or that you might have concerns about, and how are the children responding to them? Virtually, that is impossible. It's impossible to do it. And at the beginning, for some of our families, they did not even have the capacity in terms of technology for there to be a visible conversation, i.e. a FaceTime or that sort of conversation. So part of the RAG rating from my managers and the team managers in the service was to think about all of those things when they prioritised the children that they were visiting. For those children where they already had a relationship, that social work relationship was already underway, and we were seeing progress and safety plans being enacted. There would have been a difficult but a decision taken for those families to say, OK, you are slightly down the list.
Thank you, Ms. Hammond. I'm going to pause you there so that we can look at what you say in your statement about this, which I think will help us through this. If we could look, please, at paragraph 68 of your witness statement, which is at page 17. This is where you say that social work managers were asked to risk assess every child with a case file open. Beg your pardon. Now, just pausing there will be a wide range, won't there, of circumstances of children with a case file open. So would that range right from early help through to children in need, children on a child protection plan, children in local authority care? Is it right to say that that's quite a wide range?
It's a very wide range of children, yes. Yeah.
And I want to ask you about the sorts of factors that a social worker or social work manager would have had to take into account in conducting this assessment. You've already told us that you would have factored in relationships and whether or not they had a device that would mean they could engage in a remote visit. I wanted to ask, though, there are obviously children living in circumstances that would have accumulated over time, or would have the potential to accumulate over time to cause significant harm, but which themselves might not be acute. So, for example, hoarding, concerns about hygiene, emotional abuse, sustained but low-level drug and alcohol abuse.
Yes.
Those are the sorts of things that, as I say, might not be acute and suggest there's going to be harm tomorrow, but over time would build up. How does a RAG rating like this account for that?
It was very challenging. For those children who were newly referred into the service, those visits always took place face-to-face. So we were able to establish at the beginning, albeit that we could get into the house because that was another issue. But the ability of social workers to oversee and put in different types of plans for deteriorating circumstances, it was very challenging. But we had a lot of our children in the amber risk category, so you can see that what we required was face-to-face visits, but at a lower frequency than the usual statutory requirements. And a lot of our children were in that category. The children in the green level were children for whom we had known for considerable period of time, where there'd been measured and evidence-based progress over that period of time. But it would be true to say that we did not capture all the children in deteriorating circumstances during that time.
Thank you. And a point you touched on a moment ago about getting into the home.
Yes.
You said in an earlier answer that looking at a child's bedroom can be particularly important,
yes,
and you mentioned looking in the fridge, smelling a home. Is it right that a face-to-face visit in these circumstances might actually mean a doorstep visit because of social distancing?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Either a doorstep visit or a garden visit or a visit taking a child out to the park.
And does that mean things like looking at a child's bedroom, seeing their fridge, seeing the state of the bathroom might be missed?
Yes.
Thank you. You tell us, and we know from other evidence that it is something of a national trend, that the number of referrals or inquiries that the local authority received at what you call front door referrals, so
yes,
referrals from members of the public, for example, and other statutory services, significantly dropped. A member of the public, perhaps unfamiliar with how services work, might wonder whether there was any way that a local authority could have responded to that drop, anything proactive that could have been done in those circumstances. What would the answer to that be?
The safeguarding and child protection system works as well as it does, particularly in Kent, because of the multi-agency partnership nature of identifying vulnerable and at-risk children. So the overwhelming majority of our referrals will be coming from those statutory partners. And during COVID, they were diverted to do other activities, particularly our colleagues in health. And so what we did see, I think I make reference to it in my statement, was a small increase in the number of what we would call friends, family and neighbour type referrals. So members of the public were calling in at slightly higher numbers than we would see previously. I think that is because pre-COVID and under normal circumstances, those children would already have been identified at an earlier stage by our partner agencies.
Understood. Thank you. You also tell us that with regard to the amendments that were made to safeguarding duties introduced by the Adoption and Children Coronavirus Amendment Regulations, in your view, these were not overall in the best interests of vulnerable children, and you say that you would not advocate for any of these to be reinstated. Why is that, please?
I've made reference to the relationship-based nature of social work, really good social work, and I would say that the ability to not see children, their carers and other professionals in person was not in the best interests of children. What I would say is that it has, and I make reference to this in my statement, it has opened up a new way of connecting with some older children in the virtual space that has been helpful. So I wouldn't want to be saying that virtual visits in all circumstances and at all times are not a helpful tool in the social worker's toolbox.
Thank you. So may I just be very clear, when you are discussing your views of those regulations, you include in that your views of remote visiting?
Yes, I do.
If I can
yes,
put it that
yeah.
way. Thank you. In terms of the impact of all of these changes, you also tell us that the experience of your local authority is that children who were referred in late 2021 were observed to have more entrenched family challenges and complex risks.
Yes.
You say those families then required more social care time, resources and support to mitigate and reduce the child protection risk by the time those risks presented later
Yes.
in 2021. Is it your view that that complexity and degree of entrenchment of challenge is attributable to experiences during the pandemic?
I think it is, yes. Yeah, we didn't see that degree of complexity or entrenched issues prior to the pandemic.
Thank you. And one last question about your safeguarding work. As with all local authorities, Kent undertakes child safeguarding reviews
Yes.
when a child dies, excuse me, or is seriously harmed as a result of abuse or neglect. And if we could look, please, at paragraph 87 of your statement. Excuse me. You tell us here that the findings of those safeguarding reviews indicated that during the specified period, non-biological parents and carers and individuals with substance misuse experiences were more likely to evade observation from multi-agency reviews, consequently having an impact on children. You say this was more challenging for babies and early years children, and that the reviews identified challenges with the quality of assessments. Ms. Hammond, there is this is not a criticism, there is a fair amount of language there that
Yes.
only those familiar with child protection will understand. Can you tell us in simple terms what this means? What do you understand from these reviews was happening to children? And what do you mean by the quality of assessments?
So we saw an increasing number of people who were a risk to children going undetected, being in the households, not being seen as being part of that, or even being recognised as being part of that household.
And to be very clear, when you say individuals who were a risk to children, do you mean people who were physically abusive to children and families, people who may have been sexually abusive?
I do mean that, yeah, including the impact on children of their behaviour that isn't directly to the children, and that impact. In the phraseology around the quality of assessments, it came about that not knowing that those individuals were in the house inevitably negatively impact the quality of the assessment, because had we known those people were in the house and what the degree of their challenges were, whether that was substance misuse or anything else, that would have been incorporated into the assessments.
So to put it really bluntly then, for a family, for example, where there had been worries about domestic violence, if the perpetrator of domestic violence had returned to the home during lockdown, the social worker might not have been aware of that because they wouldn't have been going into the home to see who was there.
That's exactly right, yes.
I'd like to move on then to our final topic, which is about the impact of the pandemic on the position in Kent of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. Now, Ms Hammond, there is a long and somewhat complex litigation history about these issues. So I will take them at some pace, if I may, just by reference to the findings of those judgments. It's right, isn't it, that for many years prior to the pandemic, Kent had struggled to be able to accommodate the numbers of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children arriving and had relied on the National Transfer Scheme, which in principle enabled other local authorities to volunteer to receive them into other local authorities' care. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. And we know that for some years that had not been operating well in the sense that other local authorities did not routinely make those offers. Is
That's
that right?
correct, yes.
Thank you. And I want to ask you now then about how the pandemic and responses to that may have exacerbated that situation. That you tell us in your statement that the closure of ports of entry to the UK meant there was an even higher number than usual of children arriving at Kent, and particularly during the summer when the weather is fair. Is that right?
That's right, yes.
And I think the number that you give us is that there were 402 unaccompanied asylum-seeking children in Kent's care at the start of 2020, but by August 2020 this had risen to 605.
That's correct, yes.
And is it also right that some support services, such as the Refugee Council, who had been running an intake service, suspended their operations when the country went into lockdown?
That's correct, yes.
And is it right that guidance on lockdown and self-isolation, which sought to limit transmission, meant that many local authorities other than Kent appeared even less willing to receive new children into their care?
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. And in addition, guidance about isolation meant that some children, even if asymptomatic, needed to isolate for prolonged periods, presenting challenges for accommodation because foster care, for example, is more difficult in those circumstances.
That is correct, yes.
Thank you. And is it right that as a result of all of that, in August 2020, the local authority took the formal position that it would not be able to meet its statutory obligations to care for those children? And Mr. Justice Chamberlain later found that that was unlawful.
That's correct, yes.
And I think his Lordship also found that the Home Office shed some responsibility for that position because of the way that the National Transfer Scheme had been run. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
And coming then to the circumstances of those individual children in that position, would you agree that the net effect of all of that is that they were staying for longer than usual at the intake unit?
That's correct, yes, they were, yeah.
And that once processed, they were in many cases staying in unregulated accommodation?
That's correct, yes.
And also that instead of being looked after in your care, such that the local authority was a corporate parent, they were housed by the Home Office, but essentially not in anyone's care.
That's correct, yes.
Thank you. Can we look, please, at INQ 000231348, page 10. Thank you very much. This is an extract, Ms Hammond, from a report of the Children's Commissioner in the summer of 2020. And we see that she is reporting here concerns about the circumstances of these children. So, for example, that it was damaging for their well-being, including their mental health and personal dignity. And she says that in the context of many of them having arrived, having been travelling for months, fleeing their home countries, may have gone hungry, been exploited, and so on. Do you accept all of that, Ms Hammond, that those were their circumstances?
Yes, they were.
Thank you. And in your statement you say that the implementation of decisions regarding lockdowns, such as social distancing, isolation and testing, did not adequately take account of the implications of those decisions for unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. What do you say, Ms Hammond, ought to have happened? Do you think there ought to have been exemptions for children in these circumstances?
There could have been exemptions that may have assisted us some way, but what should have happened was the implementation of a full mandation of the National Transfer Scheme. other local authorities should have been mandated to take those children quickly and safely away from Kent.
And do you say that ought to have been part of the pandemic response, or is it your position that that is a separate issue from the pandemic?
It was particularly pertinent during the pandemic. You're correct in that my position is that the National Transfer Scheme should be not just mandatory in word but in action, that has been, and I'm on record of saying that, but during the pandemic it should have been one of the things that should have been implemented quickly.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms Hammond. I'm sorry that we don't have time to ask you about your lessons learned and your reflections, but we have them in your written evidence. My lady, those are all my questions. Do you have any questions of Ms Hammond?
Just one, Ms Hammond. You mentioned how you wouldn't have implemented the Adoption of Children Coronavirus Amendment regulations. What alternatives would there have been if the amendment to the regulation hadn't been made? Were there alternatives, or do you suggest the change wasn't necessary at all?
I think it was helpful to be able to do things slightly differently in the fostering panels and the adoption part. In other words, the assessment of adults putting themselves forward for foster care and for adoption. I think that we could have had a greater focus on ensuring that virtual visiting didn't become the norm. That would be my sort of thought about that virtual visiting did become seen as good as, or the norm, and that was my concern about it.
Thank you very much indeed, Ms Hammond. I'm very grateful to you for all the help you've given to the inquiry.
Thank you.
And to be honest, I don't envy you your job. As I remember, Kent is one of the most heavily populated counties in the country, isn't it?
It is, yes, and very large.
Asylum-seeking children as well.
Yes, yes.
Difficult. Thank you anyway.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
My lady, may I call the next witness, please? That's Miss Sharon Powell.
Thank you, Ms Dolan.
Oh, sorry, thank you.
You could repeat after me. I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Miss Powell, I apologise, I had something stuck in my throat. Can I ask you to give the inquiry your full name, please?
Sharon Elizabeth Powell.
Miss Powell, you ought to have a witness statement in front of you that bears the number INQ 000588062.
That's right.
And can you confirm that the contents of that statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can confirm.
Thank you. Miss Powell, I think it's correct that you originally qualified as a nurse and then became a social worker in 2005. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you became a service manager in Powys County Council from 2017 onwards. Is that also right?
That's correct.
And you then became the interim head of Children's Services in spring of 2022?
That's correct.
And you were confirmed in that position in 2023. Is that
That's
also
correct.
right? And is it correct, therefore, that you're giving evidence to this inquiry in your capacity as the head of Children's Services for Powys County Council?
That's correct.
And it's also right that there's a separate statement on behalf of Powys County Council that's been provided by Miss Anwen Orals, and that relates to its education services.
That's correct.
And are you familiar with that statement?
I am.
May I ask you then, before we go on, a bit about the children in Powys County Council? Can I ask you what type of council area it is?
Okay. Before we start, is it possible just to say something, Ma'am?
Thing about
Just to extend my sympathies to children and young people. So I'd just like to extend my sympathies to children, young people and their families who suffered as a result of the pandemic. Thank you, Ma'am. So in terms of children's services and Powys County Council, so Powys is a geographically challenged county in that it's a quarter of Wales's landmass. It borders English authorities and it has a rural population of 134,000 people living in Powys. So in terms of children's services, we have around about 950 children open to children's services. That doesn't include our early help services. There's around about 500 plus children and families that access early help services. We have a population of 221 children that are looked after, which includes our unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, and we have around about 700 children that are open under care and support. And our integrated disability team has around about 100 children open to it.
All right, I'm going to ask you, when you give evidence, if you could just slow down slightly. And I also want to say, before we go further in your evidence, it's right that I say, my lady, that some of what Miss Powell will be asked about may be distressing, and it's important that I say that now.
Thank you.
And Miss Powell, I think it's right, in fact, that Powys County Council's Children's Services quite recently had an inspection. Is that right, a joint inspection?
That's right.
And what was the outcome of that inspection?
So we had a joint inspection of child protection arrangement, which covers children's services, health, education and police. Each organisation has its independent investigation team in terms of that. So Children's Services has Care Inspectorate Wales. So the report was published and undertaken in, it was undertaken in October 2023 and the report was published later that year. So the JICPA highlighted really that there was professional accountability and identifying of children in need of help and protection. There was a culture of continuous learning and improvements. There was a strong team around the cluster approach, a really strong emphasis on domestic abuse and strong links between services. Some of the report highlights for improvements as around where a child is subject to a Section 47 inquiry where they may be at risk of significant harm, is those outcome strategy meetings needed to be more robust in terms of outcomes, that the child's voice in child protection conferences could have been heard louder and stronger. There was also highlighting issues around sharing of information in terms of health professionals. Powys County Council does not have a district general hospital, so any child that needs to attend an accident and emergency unit goes out of county for that. So what the report highlighted was the sharing of that information back into Powys, back into localities, so that school nurses could readily access that information. It also talked about improving just monitoring electively home-educated children, where we've actually seen a rise in the number of children that are electively home-educated. And they also talked about making sure that even though children were being seen at home, that they were given the opportunity of being seen alone. Oh. So as a result of the report, there was an action plan that spanned all the multi-agency approach in terms of making those improvements.
I'm grateful for you for setting that out in so much detail, and maybe we'll pick up on some of those thematic issues in the course of your evidence. But can I just then turn to the pandemic? and ask you a bit about the very outset of the pandemic. And first of all, whether or not Powys Children's Services held a plan at the outset of 2020 as to how it would provide children's services in the event of a national emergency or a pandemic situation.
And at that time, Children's Services did not have a plan.
And when did it first generate a plan in order to be able to respond to the unfolding pandemic?
So that was during March 2020. So when it was agreed that schools would close in March 2020, then there was consideration of what the impact of that might be in terms of children's services. So a business continuity plan was then developed as a part of that outcome.
So was that then very much linked to the decision to close schools?
Yeah, very much linked to the decision.
Miss Orrells says in her statement that the local authority commenced planning for the possibility that schools would have to close at pace, and immediately upon notification received from the Welsh Government on the 18th of March 2020, the local authority commenced this planning utilising the guidance provided by the Welsh Government. So can we take it from that that there was no planning for the closure of schools in Powys County Council until the 18th of March as well?
That's correct.
And I think it's right that Ms Orrells also at paragraph 13 of her statement actually confirms that as well.
That's
Is that
correct.
Right? So presumably then the decision to close schools had ramifications for all children in the Powys County Council area, but particular ramifications for the sorts of vulnerable children who the social care teams would be in contact with. Is that right?
That's right.
And I think it's also correct then that the Welsh Government issued some guidance to councils in order to assist with their case prioritisation. Is that
correct.
Right? I wonder if we could have a look at that, please. That's INQ 000511763. And I think we can see in the very first paragraph that this was a suggested framework for social services across Wales, correct?
That's correct.
So this is not specific to Powys County Council, this was to all local authorities. And I think if we go over the page, please, we can see that this was the guidance that was provided at this point in time as regards children's services, correct?
That's correct.
And I think it in fact says, if we look at the practice implications, as of the 13th of March, it is advised that. Do you think this is a document that you saw in and around the 13th of March, or do you think you saw it later?
I think it was around about that time of the 13th of March.
All right. So it goes on to say all assessments should be triaged by telephone in the first instance in order to decide whether a face-to-face meeting is essential or whether work can be done by telephone or delayed. May I ask you a couple of questions about that? Did you understand this to be guidance about all kinds of assessments that might relate to children?
Yes, I did, yes.
And one can see there that the guidance was talking about triage by telephone. It's not here referring, for example, to the use of Teams meetings or video calls or anything like that. Is that right?
That's what it says in there, yes.
Can I ask, at that point in time, would Powys County Council, for example, have had the infrastructure to start doing meetings remotely with families?
We would have had the infrastructure at that time. It was a developing infrastructure, so that sort of built in terms of its strength from the offset. In terms of triaging, in terms of all information that comes in through our front door service, that comes through by telephone or a written referral as the offset. So it is quite normal to have those telephone calls with individuals at the first point of contact into the front door.
All right, I'm going to go on to ask you how this develops, but can I ask you then about the sorts of access that the families who you would be in contact with, what access they would have had in and around this time to forms of remote technology, and whether that was a challenge to begin with?
Some families would have had that opportunity, and there were very much other families that might not have had that opportunity to have that telephone call via whatever means that would be. The other challenge for Powys County Council is that because it is geographically challenged, the internet is not available across the whole of the county. So again, that was a particular challenge that we experienced both in children's services and education services.
So just looking at this guidance, and what it says, all assessments should be triaged by telephone in the first instance in order to decide whether a face-to-face meeting is essential or whether work can be done by telephone or delayed. So again, did you understand from this guidance in terms of what the Welsh Government was saying, that the initial approach was to decide whether it was essential to see someone face-to-face or to see a family face-to-face?
Yes, that's my understanding of that.
And then this guidance goes on, I think, to set out that only business-critical work should be undertaken. And then it sets out what those functions, the business-critical functions are. And in essence, are those the kinds of steps that are taken whenever children might be at the most risk?
Yes, so it's looking at that identified need and whether it's a safeguarding referral or a care and support referral from that offset, and then determine exactly what the needs are and what the intervention needs to be.
All right. And then it sets, we can see towards the end of the page that this guidance said that less critical work should be undertaken only by telephone, Teams, Skype. These tasks may include. And then we see a number of different functions set out there. I wanted to ask you about TAF meetings and what those are.
So TAF stands for Team Around the Family. So it's a meeting that would be coordinated with the family, but also any of the agencies that might actually be working with the family at that time, predominantly school and health, but it could include third sector and other professionals.
So is Team Around the Family, is that a multi-agency team or is that just a social work team?
It's a multi-agency team.
And then if we go over the page, please. And again, I think practical implications, all home visits should be triaged by telephone in the first instance in order to decide whether a face-to-face meeting is essential or whether work can be done by telephone or delayed. So again, may I ask you about that? Was the general guidance from the Welsh Government to begin with to apply this approach of is it essential to see children who may be in these situations?
Yeah, that's right, in terms of triaging that information about whether or not it should be a face-to-face meeting or whether it can be done in a different way.
So it wasn't the other way round, as it were. Is it can this be done face-to-face?
I think the decision that we took at Children's Services was that every child was at risk of harm on the point of education and schools closing. So for us, it was very much about seeing children face-to-face as a priority and as an essential criteria rather than seeing them virtually as the first standing point. We realised that was really critical in order to have that visibility of children at that particular time.
And so did you take this guidance but develop it so that you were effectively applying a higher standard than the one it provided for?
That's correct, yes.
And do we see that reflected in the RAG rating guidance that Powys County Council then promulgated?
That's correct, yeah.
I wonder if we could have a look at that, please. That's at INQ 000 647 372. And I think we can see, Ms. Powell, if we look at red, it explains, doesn't it, that children, placements and carers that are rated as red will be visited.
That's right.
With full observance of statutory requirements, face-to-face and by a qualified social worker.
That's correct.
And then it gives some examples, doesn't it? And I think one of the examples is children on the Child Protection Register.
That's correct.
So again, is this intended to reflect those children who are at the highest index of risk?
That's correct.
And then if we look at amber, I think that suggests that children who are at amber could be visited, and supported by a combination of a qualified social worker and a non-qualified social worker. Is that right?
That's correct.
And that visiting could be combined, face-to-face and remote.
That's correct.
Is that right?
That's correct.
And again, of the examples given, one of them is that these might be the children who had moved down from the highest risk.
That's correct.
Into this category, yes. And then green was intended to reflect those children who were in long-term and settled placements. Is that right?
That's correct.
And I think there, where there were no unusual welfare-related issues or safeguarding issues, and that families were content with the interim approach to remote visiting and supervision, that these visits could be carried out remotely. Is that right?
That's correct.
I'm going to go on to ask you about some of the challenges about this, but we've heard evidence on behalf of Kent Council today about the difficulty in maintaining oversight of those families where there might, for example, be accumulated risks over time as opposed to the emergence of an acute risk. Was that a challenge in Powys as well?
Yes, that was a challenge. And I think for those children that were open to the service, we knew about those children. The particular challenge was those children that we didn't know and didn't have that information coming through, particularly when our referral rates dipped at that particular time. What we did do in terms of every child that was open to the service, as we've said, we RAG rated them, but we also made sure that social workers and any worker that was working with that family could step the RAG status either up or down at any potential point, and that they didn't need to wait for a decision around that. One of the challenges was maintaining that kind of consistent approach to visiting home visits, where we were increasing the amount of home visits we were doing as a result of the lack of visibility of children in schools or being seen by school health nurses. So there was a challenge in terms of maintaining that standard, but it was very much discussed on a daily basis in terms of what those challenges might be for a particular team or even, in fact, a particular family at that time.
All right. I think one of the things that you go on to explain in your witness statement, and I think we can see it in paragraph 77. If I could just bring that up, please. And towards the end, I'm grateful, where you set out that there were challenges for social workers in terms of understanding the lived experience for each child within the family home. And if access denied, this became a bigger challenge in fully understanding the child's circumstances. The lack of midwifery and health visitor visits alongside children not being in school created less visibility from a multi-agency perspective.
Yeah,
so I suppose there's a couple of things related to that. Then can you explain a bit more about the challenges in actually being able to get into people's houses during this period?
I mean, obviously, if the family were engaging and they were willing for you to enter the home, that was a far easier challenge than actually the challenge of them not wanting you actually to cross the threshold of their door. So that became a particular challenge for some families, particularly if they were shielding or they were really concerned about the impact of the virus. So even though you might have PPE and follow a risk assessment process of home visits to undertake that as safely as possible within the guidance, that still was a challenge for some families to actually accept you over the doorstep at that time.
And can I just ask, for children on the Child Protection Register, were remote visits ever used in respect of them?
Sometimes they were. It very much depended on the point in which the child's name was on the Child Protection Register, whether the plans were actually working as a multi-agency perspective, and whether there was a view that actually you were working towards a deregistration plan. So it very much depended on the needs and the particular risks for each child.
And was there concern within Powys about the limitations of remote visits in terms of what social workers were able to observe?
Yes, that was a real challenge because we look at the kind of trajectory for that child in the sense of their lived experience. So it's very much about looking at past harm that they might have occurred, looking at the current situation and kind of predicting and potentially what future harm might look like. So it's very much about using that information from that child's lived experience to actually assess whether that child's at risk of harm and how much risk of harm that child is at.
So did you consider that the use of remote visits then limited the ability of social workers to effectively safeguard children in these circumstances?
Yes, because remote visits, you're maybe you're having a text message or you might be having a conversation via a network to see that child in that time, but it doesn't give you that kind of holistic picture of that child in terms of their lived experience within that environment, within the family home.
All right. Another that you've just mentioned the point, and you set it out at paragraph 33, that one of the key concerns that you had in Powys was the decrease in the number of referrals that you had to what you describe as the front door of children's social services. Is that correct?
That's correct. We were really concerned that actually referral rates very much were going down when there were particular restrictions in place. When the restrictions eased or were undertaken differently, we then saw an increase in our referrals, which kind of indicates that those children were still at risk of significant harm. It's just that you don't know about them at that time until that referral is made.
And did rates recover to their normal level? In other words, what you would have expected, or did they exceed what you would have expected in normal times?
They didn't exceed at the starting point, but I think subsequently they have exceeded in more recent years.
All right. And just on that, was that concern also in the context of the understanding on the part of Powys County Council that children were at increased risk during this period of time?
That's correct, yes.
So you would have expected that the number of children coming to harm was greater.
That's right.
But you weren't seeing them.
That's right.
And I think it's also right from what you say in your statement at paragraph 34 that there was tangible evidence of children coming to greater harm because of the increase in the numbers of children on the Child Protection Register at risk of emotional or psychological abuse, which you say is ordinarily due to domestic abuse. Is that right?
That's right.
And may I ask, you mentioned domestic abuse at the very outset of your evidence. Did rates of domestic abuse increase in Powys during the pandemic?
Yes, they did. And so much so that we had to look at a particular project to support children and families in terms of May 2020, where we concentrated our early help project very much on being in touch with those families that were at risk of potential domestic abuse, because we recognised actually we weren't getting that information and those referrals through the front door.
And did those families face particular challenges during the pandemic?
Yes, they did.
And what sort of challenges did children face who were in circumstances of domestic abuse?
So children would have been exposed to that sort of continuum of domestic abuse because you have families all in the same household, all at the same time. There wasn't much opportunity for families to be out and doing other things. So everybody's confined into that one environment. So therefore, the risk of domestic abuse increased in terms of frequency. Then the impact on the child is greater because they're exposed to that more frequently in terms of visually seeing that or hearing that, or being part of that domestic abuse by trying to prevent it or stop that. Depending on the age of the child, the risk is very, very different.
And were there challenges in terms of, presumably it was principally mothers and children being able to get away from those sorts of situations that they find themselves in?
So there were challenges around that in terms of having those opportunities to get away from those situations, and also in terms of people, then their sort of network of safety that would normally sort of wrap around that, whether that was a family member or a friend, was significantly reduced at that particular time.
Ms. Powell, I'm going to move on now, if I may, to a different subject, and it's concerning the case of Kaylee Titford, who died almost 5 years ago now, and she was 16, wasn't she?
That's right.
And Kaylee had spina bifida, and she used a wheelchair. I think that's right.
That's right.
And she had a number of health needs as well. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And before I go any further, it's right to say that her parents were found guilty of her manslaughter. Yes?
That's correct.
And that was owing to the conditions within which she had lived and died. Yes.
That's correct.
I won't go into those conditions. I want to ask you about some of the issues that arose in her case to try and understand how she came to be in that position. So could you tell us a bit? I think she went to a normal a school that wasn't a school for children with special educational needs. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Kaylee went to a mainstream school. She did have profound disabilities, and as you said, she was wheelchair bound, but that didn't determine her from actually engaging in curriculum activities, and she was particularly sporty in terms of what she was able to achieve.
And once the announcement was made that schools would close to most children, did she go back to school after that point on the 18th of March 2020?
No, she didn't.
And I think it's correct that she was identified as vulnerable, so she could have attended a hub in Wales, is that right?
That's correct.
But she didn't do that. And what's your understanding as to why she didn't attend one of the hubs?
My understanding is that Kaylee was fearful of the virus herself and maybe contracting that by being a member of the hub, so she chose not to engage in that.
I think the case review suggests that she was shielding, is that right?
That's correct.
And she was going to go back to school in September 2020, wasn't she?
That's right.
But she didn't go back, and again, it appears, I think, from the case review that her parents made excuses as to why she couldn't go back. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding, yes.
So can I ask you then, during this period that she wasn't in school, from March leading up to October, how was contact maintained with the family?
So contact was maintained initially with the family with the Youth Intervention Service very early on, but they actually ended their involvement with Kaylee at around about that March, April time. In terms of...
Can I just, sorry, forgive me for interrupting you, but the Youth Intervention Service, was that part of Power Social Care, or is that a different service?
It's part of education services. So she received some support from them because she had made reference to feeling bullied at school. So they were doing a piece of work with her to enable her to kind of overcome some of those complications, which she did. And then they actually closed the case file in terms of any identified needs for her. So from March 2020...
And forgive me for interrupting you again, but just so we're clear, so was her case closed because that piece of work with her had finished?
That's correct.
Rather than, that wasn't linked to the pandemic, is that correct?
No, that wasn't linked to the pandemic. That's correct.
Thank you.
So in terms of education services, they were the main professional organisation that were involved in Kaylee's care and plan at that time. So they would make routine phone calls to Kaylee during that period. I think there are 2 occasions when they actually spoke with Kaylee herself, but predominantly from September to October, the conversations were held weekly, but predominantly with Mother, who was then actually saying that Kaylee was too unwell to return to school at that time.
All right, so throughout that entire period, Kaylee herself was only spoken to on 2 occasions by Education Services. From the case review, there doesn't seem to be any mention at all of Kaylee participating in school by way of remote access or using video calls or any of the sorts of structures that might have been in place for educating children in their homes. Is that your understanding as well?
Yes, that's my understanding as well.
And I think from reading the case review, I think there's a single reference to Teams being used on one occasion to speak with the family, but they weren't able to use Teams. Is that right?
That's my understanding as well.
Do you know any reasons why, or do you know anything about the fact the family or Kaylee herself don't appear to have had any technology or any of the assistance that might have been provided to children in order that they could have remote education, for example?
Yeah, I don't have any other information.
So we know Kaylee had disability and health needs. The case review said that she didn't have any form of care and support plan. Can you explain a bit more about that?
So Kaylee had a care and support plan in her early years, and again that care and support plan would have been a multi-agency plan, so it would have involved school and health or any other organisation, as well as children's services working with the family in terms of her care and support needs. During her primary school years, she was had developed really well in terms of align with her disabilities. She was reaching her potential within school, so there was nothing being raised that was any specific concern about Kaylee having any particular care and support needs at that time. So in 2017, Children's Services, with consent from the family, closed the case file in respect of Kaylee at that time, suggesting that there was no identified care and support needs for her at that time.
And that's despite the fact that on the face of it, she did have health needs.
Yes, that's right.
It appears. I mean, in your view, is that one of the critical points here? That the fact that she didn't have that sort of plan, is it the fact that she didn't have that plan that meant that she wasn't subject then to any sorts of assessments during the period of the pandemic? Or is it more complex than that?
I think it's more complex than that in the sense that at no point did any agency such as Health, Third Sector or Education Services put a multi-agency referral form around Kaylee's needs maybe changing or being different through our front door service, which would have picked that up. I think there were agencies working with Kaylee, but in terms of the joined up thinking about her lived experience and potentially looking and reflecting on her transition points, as seen as she was nearly 16, in terms of maybe into early adulthood, there was no joined up thinking around any changes in her needs or any changes in her circumstances, and also in terms of her parents' ability to care for her. So that hadn't been raised at all either by any of the organisations in terms of them finding that more difficult or challenging. So again, no referral had been made in terms of a carer's assessment as one example. So I think the situation was very complex in terms of that, but the learning very much suggests that actually the joined up thinking wasn't there in terms of those agencies coming together to kind of review Kaylee's particular situation.
I think you mentioned that there were some services in contact. The case review said that the team around the family, which is one of the bits of the structure that I asked you about earlier, ceased its involvement in April.
Yeah.
And again, can you throw any light on the reasons why that contact was stopped at that particular point in time?
At that particular point, my understanding is that no agency was suggesting that Kaylee had any unmet needs or any identified needs that warranted any particular service involvement at that time.
So is the crucial issue here that no part of any organisation gave thought to the fact that, for example, this is a child who, by virtue of shielding, might be exposed to isolation, a lack of physical, being confined within the home, not being able to get out, those sorts of considerations that might make you think, actually, this is a child who probably needs to be assessed now to make sure that they're coping with the circumstances that they're now finding themselves in.
That's correct. Yeah.
And again, based on everything you know, is there a point, is what part of the machinery ought to have triggered that or given thought to this child's circumstances so that that sort of assessment took place?
I think my reflection is that that could have happened at a number of different juncture points, particularly with health professionals joining up the information in terms of maybe not being brought to many appointments and having consideration about the impact on Kaylee's health at that time, particularly around her lymphedema, where she had a sore in terms of her lower limbs. So in terms of health professionals, that information hadn't been joined up, particularly between medical departments in terms of looking at her situation holistically. And I think the same for education services, although they were making routine phone calls to Kaylee, and she had a statement of educational needs review in July 2020, yes, whereby she did participate, or by it, she was heard to participate in the background from that meeting. At no point was Kaylee actually seen, visually seen, either on a Teams call or other ways in terms of internet opportunity. So nobody actually was seeing her visually.
Yes, and to come back to a point you made, there was no trigger for her family to be assessed at any point to see if they were coping with these circumstances as well. Is that right?
I'm sorry to interrupt, Ms. Robin. I'm just conscious that, as dreadful as this case was, I'm not conducting an inquiry into the circumstances of individual deaths. And could we focus, please, on whether there are systemic issues related to the pandemic that we need to be talking about?
So just in terms of those, and I was just going to draw these things together in terms of the lessons learned for the purposes of the pandemic, but the assessment of the family, do you consider that that's perhaps an important point of learning here, that in a pandemic situation, a focus on the family and what their needs are, an assessment of that could be important?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me that the learning is around if agencies were concerned about a child, or maybe even there were lower level concerns about that child, that should have kind of created a response that some things were changing for Kaylee, and therefore they could have placed a multi-agency referral form into Children's Services at any point. So I agree that it was that lack of joined up thinking and that assessment process.
And then maybe leading on from that, I wanted to ask you whether or not it also indicates a potential systematic issue related to a pandemic about the need to assess children who are shielding as well, and to ensure that there is some sort of automatic assessment that involves seeing the child.
I agree. I think in terms of that systemic approach, that would have been really helpful to kind of had that joined up thinking locally for children with disabilities that may or may not be open to Children's Services, and potentially, as you said, with shielding, their needs may have changed. Families might have found that really difficult. So I think it would have been an opportunity to just reflect on those individual children's experiences.
And then again, just focusing on the pandemic-related issue, the importance of the child's voice as well, and ensuring that there are proper opportunities to meaningfully engage with the child as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think looking at Kaylee's situation, there was very limited times when she was in conversation, whether that was text message, WhatsApp, or a virtual call with any professional or anyone that she might have considered a trusted adult. That was definitely a gap in terms of her lived experience.
Thank you. And I wondered whether following on from that, or following on from all of your experiences in POWs during the pandemic, whether there were specific recommendations that you had that you thought were important.
I think for me, it's about looking at a child's lived experience as a whole. So there was not brought policy that was implemented by Powys Teaching Health Board as part of the learning. is a way in which you would join up the dots of a child actually having multiple health appointments, so that the child would be more visible if that information was joined up. I think the same for the Eyes On policy for education services. That has changed dramatically over recent years. So children are now visually seen by education services, particularly if their education drops or there's a change in circumstances. I think both those policies would be really helpful to be considered on a more national basis. But I think for me, it's about also that team around the family, that cluster group arrangement. So where where professionals are coming together, that actually the child is put at the heart of that information. So whatever agency is involved in that child, whether that's children's services or not, there should be more stronger protocols on what that needs to look like, what to do in the event of any change in circumstances at all, the need for a referral into children's services or not. And then if there are any particular challenges around that, I think it would be really helpful to have an escalation process that professionals could follow to escalate those concerns.
I'm just going to ask you to pause there. So is this a very specific national emergency pandemic process that you foresee that is different to normal processes that enables that escalation?
I think some of that is normal, but I think it's about strengthening it in times when business continuity plans evoke. The less professionals that see children become invisible. So it's really important that the visibility of children and the lived experience of children is really central to all of that protocol and policy.
And may I also ask you, whilst we're on looking to the future, you know from your evidence and from that given by Miss Orals as well, that it was difficult to attract children into the hub schools during the first period of school closures. Has POWIS done any reflection on or work on that in terms of developing its thinking about what could be done to attract more children into education in the future in these sorts of circumstances?
Yes, reflection has been had, and some of that was highlighted in the joint investigation of child protection arrangements in terms of that team around the cluster of a child is stronger. There's more multi-agency focus on children that are in that cluster, and then kind of reflecting on their individual needs and what that might mean.
So in other words, do you mean that what was required was more dialogue and intervention with families in order to encourage children to attend that sort of hub provision?
Yes, that's right.
Thank you. Ms. Powell, those are all my questions. My lady, do you have any questions?
No, thank you very much indeed. I don't have any questions. Thank you very much for all the help you've given the inquiry, Ms. Powell. I'm really grateful to you. I appreciate it. Not easy when you're talking about horrid cases like the one you've had to describe. Especially if there may be failings in the system. But I'm really grateful. It's given us some food for thought. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, my lady.
Very well, Ms. Roberts. Is it time now to break for lunch?
Yes, that takes us to the short adjournment.
Okay, I shall be back at 1:45.